I again want to thank you as we're coming out of COVID protection. And I want to thank you for following along and hanging in there with us and staying active as master gardeners. And we're going to abide by IFAS and CDC guidelines. So check with your coordinator before volunteering, but we do see the light at the end of the tunnel. And I also want to thank you all for your patience as we've moved over to Better Impact as our new volunteer management system. Thank you all so much for that. I want to let you know that we have over in the last 2 months logged 41,000 volunteer hours already into Better Impact. So we are off to a good start. So thank you. And if you haven't been able to get it yet, please let me know, let your coordinator know, and we will work with you to get you feeling more comfortable with Better Impact. And I did want to let you know that the Master Gardener State Conference will be virtual. I know it's kind of sad, but that'll be the 3rd week of October, and the Search for Excellence Awards are due on August 15th. So if you're interested in turning in a Search for Excellence Award, get with your coordinators. They will get you hooked up with the forms and how to fill those out. So if you have an awesome project that you want to have highlighted, we have some great categories that you could fall under. Okay. So our presenter today is Alyssa Vinson. She is currently a horticulture extension agent in Manatee County. She oversees the Master Gardener Volunteer Program. She's the Master Gardener Coordinator there. Prior to that, she worked in Sarasota County. She did Sarasota County Mangrove Protection for quite a while. And I'm hoping that she's got some stories when she got to write somebody a big ticket. I'm just waiting for that. And she was also a Sarasota County program assistant as well. She is a science educator. She taught my daughter. She was her science teacher. I think it was in 5th grade. But was it 5th, Alyssa?
7th grade.
7th grade. Well, time flies. So, but she really sparked interest in science and shared with her students the wonder and the magic and the intensity and the specialness of science. And from working with her master gardeners, I know that she awakens that knowledge in them too. So she is a real known science educator, and that's something that we are so proud and happy to have her with us in IFAS Extension. So Alyssa, I'm going to let you go ahead and share. And if you want to fill in a little bit of your bio as we go along, but go ahead, I'm going to stop share and you can go ahead and share screen.
All right. Go ahead and share. I'm going to get this up in display mode. There you go. So can everybody see that all right? Looks good? Okay. Yes, so I did have the pleasure of teaching Wendy's daughter, and that was a really fun year of teaching for me. It was very interactive. I got a chance to do a lot of really fun projects. So yeah, that brought back a lot of memories, Wendy. Thank you for sharing that. So as Wendy said, my name is Alyssa Vinson. I'm the residential horticulture agent here in Manatee County. And before that, I did work for Sarasota County in the Environmental Protection Division. And I did that for about 3 years. And I was lucky enough to help write the ordinance in Sarasota County for mangrove protection, as well as create the professional mangrove trimmer certification program and registration system that the county uses now to register folks that do permitted mangrove trimming work within Sarasota County. And so I really developed a love for mangroves when I was an undergrad at the University of South Florida. Go Bulls, I know. And I got a chance to spend about a week down in Rookery Bay working on a research project. And it was hot and there were a lot of mosquitoes and no-see-ums. But over the course of that week, I was documenting commensal plant species and looking at germination rates of different mangroves, and really just spending a lot of really intimate time with these incredible plants and ecosystems. And it really cemented a really fierce love for them deep in my heart. And so, you may be thinking to yourself, well, why is a horticulture agent talking to me about mangroves? And it's because I really, I have kind of taken them on as my special project and work a lot with folks who have mangroves on their coastline, whether coastal property or HOAs that have mangroves, or working with municipal governments to train the folks who maintain mangroves on public lands as well. So that's a little bit about me. I do have a master's in ecological restoration, and before that, I have a bachelor's in environmental science and policy. But as Wendy said, I really, I've spent the majority of my professional career doing science education, and it's something that I am happy to continue doing in my capacity as an agent. So what we're going to talk about today is a mangrove. What are mangroves? And I really, the word mangrove is used to describe not only a plant or a grouping of plants, but it's also used to describe a type of ecosystem. And so when we talk about mangrove, it can be applied in the singular or plural sense. It can be applied to a plant or it can be applied to a community. And so when we look at the global distribution of mangroves, we can see that they kind of fall in this tropical subtropical range. This map here, all the green is showing you the extent of mangrove coastlines throughout the world. We're really familiar with mangroves that look like this photo here. This is a red mangrove, and we'll talk more about how to identify them in a little bit. So sometimes mangroves look like this, and they're out in the standing water. Sometimes they're up in the landscape. They can be in a dry area like this white mangrove here. White mangroves in Florida don't have to be in standing water in order to be happy and thrive. And they might also look like this black mangrove here on the right-hand side, which is living kind of in this zone where it's not fully in standing water, but you can tell that maybe at high tide, its little pneumatophores here are covered in water. And we'll talk more about what those pneumatophores are in a minute. Sometimes mangroves look like this, fully in the water. Does anybody, I won't have you put it in the chat box, but these brown lumps right here are camels. And these camels are actually grazing on these mangroves. They get brought down there in big herds, and they actually graze on mangroves in some parts of the world. And so they can be used as forage, and they also are used as timber in some parts of the world. In Florida, we can even get mangroves that look like this one here on the right. This is 64 feet tall. This is the state champion red mangrove. It's down in Lee County. I don't know exactly where because it's on private property, but if anybody knows, please take me there. I want to see this beautiful mama red mangrove. So when we think of mangroves in the landscape, we don't often think of them in this manner. We don't think about them as forage for camels or, over 60 feet tall. But that's a reality of these plants that we have. And, of the types of plant species that you find in mangrove ecosystems, worldwide, there's somewhere around 70 plants that are identified as mangrove species. Here in Florida, we have about 4 of those plants that are on, some of those lists of world mangrove species. So again, about 8% of the world's coastlines have mangroves. They are in that tropical and subtropical distribution. Something to recognize, though, is that we have lost about 35% of the world's mangroves in just the last 20 or so years. And there are different reasons for this mangrove loss, and we'll talk about some of the threats to mangrove systems in a little while. But just know that they are global. They take up about 8% of the world's coastlines, but they are diminishing in some parts of the world. They exist in an environment that we would term an estuarine environment. And this is an area where our salt water and our fresh water mix and commingle and create brackish water. And so mangrove species actually do require some freshwater input. They can't stand in salt water all the time and not have any fresh water. They have to be in that area where salt and fresh are mixing. They also don't like to be in areas that have incredibly high energy coastlines. So areas where there's a lot of really frequent heavy wave action, they're not typically going to be found growing in those areas. So this is why you would find them on the backside of a key, let's say, rather than on the Gulf side of the key. Over here on the West Coast, I refer to things a lot as the Gulf side because we have a lot of keys here in Southwest Florida. So on that Gulf side where you'd have a lot of that wave action, you're not going to find the mangroves, but on the back side, on the bay side, you would find them because this is a lower energy coastline, easier for them to get established in these areas. They have special adaptations to deal with their exposure to salt. So these species are either going to be salt excluders, meaning they can kind of close up the tissues of their bodies and prevent salt from entering their bodies, or at least minimize the amount of salt that's entering their plant tissue. Or they're going to be salt extruders, meaning they're going to accumulate salt within them, but then they're going to push it out through their leaves. There are other adaptations related to red mangroves in particular. When we look at lenticels, which are something that's found on tree species in general, corky tree species have these lenticels that can open and close and allow for gas exchange. And on red mangroves, these lenticels will actually close up during the high tide. So the high tide comes up and the lenticels close so that it protects the red mangrove prop roots from getting all that salt water into them. They also exhibit a trait called vivipory, meaning they actually begin the germination process while the seed is still on the parent plant. So you have the seed inside of the fruit. The seed actually starts germinating, erupts through that fruit on the parent plant, and then it drops away from the parent plant and travels. And with red mangroves in particular, I'll show you on the next slide what the propagules look like, but these can float for up to a year before they establish in a location. And there's actually some really neat research showing how quickly, if you have a red mangrove propagule landing horizontally on its side, it actually only takes about a week for it to straighten itself up and drop its roots down and start to put out its leaves. So here in Florida, we have 4 species, as I said, of trees that are considered mangroves. We have red mangroves, Rhizophora mangala, and this is the tree that you're going to find most waterward of our coastline. So it's going to be usually in standing water, particularly at high tide, and it has adventitious roots that reach out into the water and actually provide this kind of horizontal growth to the plant. They can drop these adventitious roots down from their branches. So on a really tall red mangrove, you'll have roots dropping down from 24 feet or 30 feet into the water. They produce these pencil-like propagules that you can see here on the left-hand photo with the reddish-brown tip at the bottom and then the green up at the top. And the reddish-brown area is going to become the roots, and the greenish part at the very tip will become the leaves. Next in line, if we're kind of going in line according to where they fall in the water, would actually be black mangroves or white mangroves. They kind of occupy a similar area. Black mangroves have pneumatophores that come up through the soil. They look like fingers, finger-like projections that come up through the soil. And these allow the black mangrove to exchange gases in this inundated soil. So, right, if you took a plant in a pot and you put that pot in a bucket of water and the soil was full of water, the plant would die, right? And it would die really quickly because the roots didn't have any kind of adaptations to exchange gases. You would suffocate that plant. So black mangroves, because the soil that they occupy, white mangroves as well, the soil that they occupy will occasionally be fully inundated with water. They have to have some way to exchange gases. So black mangroves put up these finger-like pneumatophores, And white mangroves will also put up pneumatophores, but they don't look the same. They're kind of rounder and knobbier than the black mangrove pneumatophores. And they also tend to occupy the spaces further upland. Black mangroves, if we were looking at a kind of a cross section of a typical mangrove system prior to coastal development, what you would tend to find is that red mangroves will collect a lot of sediment. And as they collect sediment, they build up some land surface and create almost like a little berm. And then you get these areas that kind of dip back down behind the red mangrove line. And that's where you typically find a lot of the black mangroves concentrated. They have the highest salt tolerance of the 3 species that are protected here in Florida. And that's because they occupy these areas that get full of water at high tide. And then as the tide recedes, that water sticks around, and as it evaporates, the salt concentration actually increases. And so black mangroves have a really good set of adaptations to help protect them from that high salinity water in kind of those backwater marsh areas. White mangrove leaves are the most distinct of these 3 species, being very round with a slight notch at the tip. They also have 2 little bumps right on the petiole, right at the base of the leaf. And these are called nectaries, and they do just what they sound like they do. They produce nectar. There is some misinformation out there from about 20 years ago saying that they excreted salt through those little bumps on the petiole, but they don't. Those are just, as I said, those are nectaries. So differences in leaf. Red and black mangroves have similar shaped leaves, but black mangroves, and I'm going to show you a close-up on the next slide of black mangrove leaves, but black mangroves have this really gorgeous bluish green underside and a fuzziness to them. There's a little bit of pubescence on the leaf, so they're kind of fuzzy, and they have this really upward form that they take on the tree. And so you'll see the black mangrove branches reaching up, and you'll see the leaves also kind of reaching up, and they show off that nice gray-green color. Red mangrove leaves tend to be really bright, and the bottom side is kind of a yellow-green. Now I call out buttonwoods separately from the other 3 species. And I apologize, I didn't give you the botanical names for white and black. White mangroves are Liguncula racemosa, and black mangroves are Avicennia germinans. So you'll notice that those 3 species are not in the same genus, right? We have Rhizophora, Mangala, Liguncularia racemosa, and then Avicennia germinans. So we have 3 distinct genuses, but they're all referred to as mangroves because of the halophytic traits that they express. So that salt-loving set of traits that they have. Also, with those 3 species, the leaf arrangement is opposite. So all 3 of the protected mangrove species in the state of Florida have an opposite leaf arrangement. Buttonwoods are going to be found in the same area as the other 3 species. They're typically not found in areas that are inundated for long periods of time, but they can handle some inundation. They have a more leathery leaf, and you'll notice that the leaf margin actually extends down the petiole on the buttonwoods, and they have an alternate leaf arrangement. So it's really easy when you're out looking at these fringe coastlines, trying to determine which is which, because you can tell immediately if it's protected by the law or not as to whether it has an opposite or an alternate leaf arrangement. I love black mangroves. They're my favorite. So I'm going to show you this up close photo of what it looks like when they extrude salt. So remember I said they have these special adaptations. They can take salt into their bodies and then they push it out through the leaf surface. And so you can actually see the crystals of salt that show up on the leaves after it has some time to evaporate over the course of a day. And it's really fun to take people out and to have them lick these leaves because they are so salty, and they just sparkle. And that's one of the reasons that I love them so much. They have this beautiful gray-green underside, and then the leaves just sparkle by the time the afternoon rolls around. So they have this dark bark, these creepy finger pneumatophores coming up out of the soil, and then they just glisten. So they're really, black mangroves, I think, are my favorite. And here's a close-up of the flower. A lot of the black mangroves are just kind of reaching the end of their flowering season here for us. It runs from March through the end of June. Red mangroves are going to flower and fruit all year round. White mangroves tend to have a similar flowering season to black mangroves. So again, March kind of through the end of June. Okay. So those are the species. Those are the particular plants that we would call mangroves. But remember that a mangrove is not just a singular, right? Mangrove is also a community. And so it's important for us to think about them from an ecosystem perspective. So what is a mangrove ecosystem? Well, a mangrove ecosystem is going to contain all of the biotic, living, or abiotic, non-living components that you find within these estuaries, these salt-rich communities. And one of the things that we find about mangrove ecosystems is that they are really built on junk, detritus, decomposing leaf litter. They have a high deposition rate of leaves because they have they accumulate this salt slowly over time, and they drop a lot of leaves, and they're subject to a lot of high winds and things like that that break branches and toss leaves around. And they also, because of those red mangrove prop roots and the black mangrove pneumatophores, they catch a ton of sediment and different kinds of leaf litter from upstream. Remember that these plants live in an area where they're getting flushed with water from upstream, heads out into the marine ecosystem. And so they're catching all of this sediment, all of this leaf litter, and they're holding on to it, and they're decomposing it. And so this detritus kind of builds the foundation for this really rich ecosystem that then feeds microbes and zooplankton and fish and crustaceans, bivalves, reptiles, birds, all of these hundreds of species that rely on this breakdown of detritus that's facilitated by these tree species. And we'll talk about kind of the importance and ecosystem services that they provide in a little bit. But this is what an ecosystem in a mangrove area looks like. It's really built by the soil, by the detritus, by everything breaking down. I've just been reading recently about the different fungal communities in mangrove ecosystems, and it's really interesting because they have to be able to live in these high salt areas. So you might be asking yourself, okay, you're a horticulture agent. What is all this ecology, marine environment? What does this have to do with a landscape? And that's a good question. But I think for those of us who live in coastal communities, we can recognize that they have changed over time. And where mangroves may once have been kind of out away from where people live, we are now smack dab against the edges of our mangrove systems. And so you can kind of see an example here of the end of an estuary. You've got this fresh water kind of flowing out through here out into the marine system, and this is all mangrove in here. And a lot of Southwest Florida and Southeast Florida now looks more like this, where we've created a lot of hardened surfaces. And this is a mangrove here. These are mangroves here. And so we now interact with the coastlines that would once have been these kind of transitional mangrove systems, with red mangroves in the most waterward area, and then black and white mangroves and buttonwoods kind of occupying that area behind there. So as we interact with our landscapes in these areas of hardened coastline, it's important for us to kind of understand what was here before us. And to that point, I am going to go ahead and grab the annotate tool here really quick. And I'm going to circle this area right here in the middle of this picture. So this is 1973. This image comes from 1973, and this is here in Manatee County. So if anybody's familiar with our area, this is Anna Maria right here, Anna Maria Island. I actually got married right out here at the tip of Anna Maria Island. So this is Anna Maria Island. This is the Manatee River coming out into Tampa Bay. And so I've kind of circled this spot. Keep your eye on this spot here. Now, at this point in 1973, we did have some federal and state protections for mangroves. So you won't really see a huge reduction in the amount of mangroves that exist, but just watch as we change from 1973 to 2006. So you can see that an area in the middle here that we highlighted has now been developed. And along with that development comes impervious surfaces, landscapes, and much that land.
Alyssa, you're getting a little hung up. You may want to stop sharing video for a little bit.
Okay, how's that? Can you hear me okay?
That's better. I'm not sure what's going on. Okay.
Okay, that's all right. You can just listen to my voice.
I'm not hearing you, Alyssa. Uh-oh. Emily.
Oh, I think we lost her. She lost connection.
Yep, she lost connection. There's a lot of storms out there today, and I wonder if she's not in the middle of one. I know Janice said that DeLand had a major thunderstorm, so hopefully she will come on back in.
Yeah, just give her a minute, guys, and let's see. It might take her a minute or two to get back in unless she lost power.
We'll just hang on here for a minute. Here she comes. Hi.
Hello.
Hi, welcome back.
Thanks. My internet just blipped for a second there and I lost you guys entirely. Let me reshare where I was at.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. So as we went from 2006 to 2015, right? That's, you know, a pretty short period of time. We can see we had about double the amount of development occur in this area that is fringed by mangroves, right? The mangroves are still there, but the configuration of those mangroves has changed because as these developments were put into place, now these mangroves that were probably, 30 feet tall, a lot of them have been trimmed to allow for these folks that live there to see the water. And so we have a lot of trimming occurring now, and we've also changed the land surface. We have impervious surfaces and we have stormwater ponds, we have managed landscapes. I know for a fact that the development to the north has a lot of issues growing their turf grass because they have some saltwater infiltration in their irrigation water. And so this is a significant change in what was occurring from 1973 to 2015. And I highly encourage all of you as Master Gardener volunteers to read the Florida 2070 report. There's some really beautiful maps in it. But one of the things that is a key takeaway for this presentation in thinking about mangroves is that as Florida continues to develop, we are developing predominantly on our coast, right? We have some spots along the I-4 corridor that are starting to get really heavily developed, but the majority of kind of development is concentrated along our coastlines. And so this is going to have a direct impact on our remaining mangrove ecosystems. So you can see here, anticipated development, red is developed, dark green is protected, light green is other, also agricultural lands. So as we develop the land surface, Well, here in Florida, we are surrounded by water wherever we are. You could be standing in the middle of a spot that's high and dry in the center of the state, and you're still surrounded by water. And that's because of our geology, right? We have karst geology, limestone underneath our feet. Water moves underneath us. And so as we change the land surface, so do we change the hydrology, the movement of water throughout our entire system. And I think we all can recognize as well that as land surface changes, our surface water quality changes as well. And remember that mangroves exist in this region where they're getting flushed all of this water from the upland system out into the marine environment. And so they're going to be kind of that intermediary, that boundary between the freshwater and the saltwater. As we move in as well with our developments, we also bring with us some things that shouldn't be here as considered, our invasive plant species. And so you can see we've got Brazilian pepper here, air potato. Brazilian pepper is actually one of the few invasive plant species in our area that can dominate a mangrove system. They have salt tolerance that allows them to really impact our mangrove systems. Brazilian pepper, carrotwood, and Australian pine are the three species that are a really big threat. In some cases, beech napaca as well. But those three species are really pervasive in disturbed environments. And so we tend to bring them along with us. And I'm gonna ask you to, we'll have questions towards the end. I forgot to remove that slide. So we know what mangroves are. We know that they're trees. We know that they're halophytic, that they have this really cool ability to start to germinate their seeds while they're still on the plant. We know that they can withstand these really harsh conditions. But what do they do for us? Well, they come with a whole host of ecosystem services. And one of those is serving as a keystone species within the mangrove ecosystem. They are critical to ecosystem function. And so they provide the base for the entire, remember, mangrove is singular and it represents a community, right? So they provide the base for the mangrove community, which then in turn supports hundreds of other life forms. Since they have this unique ability to capture all this sediment and kind of hold the soil, and also red mangroves reach out horizontally and can build their own islands, they are great at erosion control. They also make wonderful sponges for energy. During tropical storms and hurricanes, mangrove ecosystems can buffer up to 60% of that wind and wave energy. And I have a whole bunch of links that I'm going to share in the chat at the end here so that you can see. There's a really good video that highlights this, the ability of mangrove systems to buffer this energy. They provide critical habitat. In Southwest Florida, about 80% of our commercially and recreationally important fish species depend on mangroves at some point in their life cycle. Statewide, our recreational fishing industry is a huge moneymaker tourism-wise. And the same goes for birding, right? These mangroves provide critical habitat for some of our endangered bird species, things like roseate spoonbills and wood storks. And we have a huge industry related to people coming down, participating in ecotourism, and viewing these bird species. They also are excellent at sequestering carbon. They pull it out of the atmosphere and they store it in the soil. They are more efficient at this than a tropical rainforest. And one of the things that makes them unique in their carbon storage is that they're storing their carbon in a ratio much higher in the soil than they do in actually the tissues of their bodies. And this is one of the reasons why it's critically important to protect mangrove ecosystems, because as they're removed, that carbon, that CO2 is then released from the soil when they're not there anymore. They provide excellent sediment capture. So water clarity is something that mangroves provide. And if you've heard any presentations on seagrasses or corals, or if you're, familiar with those things, seagrass will only grow if it has a particular water clarity. It needs a certain amount of sunlight to permeate in order for it to be healthy. And coral is the same way. So without our mangroves catching all this sediment that's flushing out from the upstream areas, we don't have the necessary water clarity for things like seagrasses and healthy corals. They're also really good at capturing things like heavy metals, as well as nitrogen and phosphorus, and storing it in the soil. So these are just some of the ecosystem services that mangroves provide us. And there are wildly different estimates as to a kind of money valuation. I've seen everything from, $8,000 per hectare per year, all the way up to $200,000 per hectare per year. And so it's a wide range there, but I think you can all see that there are lots of services that these systems and these plants in particular provide to us. So if we know that they're important, we know that they have a limited distribution across the globe, and we also know that they're under threat from things like coastal development, and in other parts of the world, aquaculture, timber harvest. We have established rules to protect them. And I'm going to go through, you can get really in the weeds with this kind of stuff. And I feel fairly confident talking about it because I did it for a few years, mangrove regulation. Wendy asked me to share a story about a time when I had to give somebody a really big ticket. And I would say I had to give a few of those, but one of my favorite stories is having to walk up to a guy wielding a chainsaw in the middle of nowhere on Siesta Key and waving him down with my bathymetry rod saying, "Stop, stop, stop," to try to get him to stop cutting the mangroves because they didn't have permission to do so. And having him turn off the chainsaw and then look at me and say, "You're the mangrove regulator?" I'm 5'6" and fairly slight. So it was a fun interaction. So our mangroves are protected here in Florida. They're protected at the federal level by our national wetlands rules, right? We have the no net loss of wetlands. That was as a result of the 1972 Clean Water Act. Some of those rules were established. There have been some updates to the national wetlands rules over the last 10 years or so. But in general, we have kind of this federal scaffolding to protect wetlands. And this is implemented through the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, as well as the Army Corps of Engineers and different water management districts. There is also additionally a state legislation, the 1996 Mangrove and Trimming Preservation Act. And this allows for the riparian right to view. So it codifies it. It says that if you're a property owner on the water, you have a right to be able to see the water. But it also says that mangroves are protected from unregulated trimming or removal. And part of that state legislation allows for local municipalities and governments to receive what's called local delegation, meaning that they can take on the responsibility of enforcing rules at the local level. So what do you need to know as somebody who might interact with an individual that has a question? In all cases, if someone comes to you and asks you a question and says, "Hey, I have these mangroves on my shoreline, what can I do with them?" You should probably send them to your agent, but also remind them that they're protected and that they're incredibly important and that they should really not cut them if they can help it. So there are certain exemptions though, for individuals if they want to trim the mangroves on their property. If they have private property where the mangroves are taller than 10 feet from the substrate and aren't trimmed below 6 feet, and this is overall height. If you take a pole, stick it in the water to where the roots are actually rooted into the soil, measure that overall height of the mangrove, they have to be 6 to 10 feet in order for them to qualify for this private property exemption. There are also shoreline length considerations. The property shoreline cannot be longer than 150 feet. And if it is greater than 150 feet, they have to hire a professional mangrove trimmer, and they can only trim 65% of the mangroves along that shoreline. So you can see that we're already getting into a lot of really detailed information. And some people don't even know how long their shoreline is. And so you might want to help them find some resources like aerial imagery, distance measuring tools on Google Earth, things like that, that they could use to help them kind of figure out if they meet the qualifications for an exemption. Along with height and shoreline length, they also have to have a shoreline where the mangroves are not deeper than 50 feet. So this is coming from the shoreline out into the water. They can't be deeper than 50 feet. And they have to meet this state definition of a riparian mangrove fringe, which I'm not going to go into in too much depth because it is pretty sticky. There's a really great publication that the Department of Environmental Protection put out that shows kind of what is allowable trimming. And I'm going to share the direct link with you in the chat here at the end. So generally, if your shoreline is 150 feet or less, 50 feet deep or less, between 6 and 10 feet in height, then a homeowner can go out there and they can trim those mangroves themselves. They can hire just a landscaper to go out there and trim them. Once you get above 10 feet though, you have to hire a professional mangrove trimmer. 16 feet and taller, you have to hire a PMT, and the trimming has to be staged so that you're not removing any more than 25% of the foliage annually. Okay, so it's really, really good for individuals to reach out to a professional mangrove trimmer, and I'll tell you who those are in just a second. Here in our area, I do have some phone numbers specifically. Pinellas County, Hillsborough County, and Sarasota County are in blue because they have local delegation of the state mangrove rule. So they actually have additional requirements for professional mangrove trimmers. In Sarasota County, they have to go through a training and then take a test and pass the test and then register with the county in order to be a professional mangrove trimmer. Here in my county, it's still the state DEP that enforces the rule, and so this would be the number that you would call there. But again, if you live in a different part of the state, reach out to your local Department of Environmental Protection office. Professional mangrove trimmers are folks that meet one of these qualifications. So they have to be an ISA certified arborist or a professional wetland scientist, certified environmental professional, certified ecologist, or a landscape architect that's licensed under this particular Chapter 481. Landscape architects do have to go through some additional training in order to meet the professional mangrove trimmer qualification. Again, delegated local governments may have additional requirements, and the DEP maintains a list on their webpage of state authorized professional mangrove trimmers. So remember that if you get questions from folks in your counties about what do I do with the mangroves, first thing would be don't trim them unless you have to. Second would be reach out to a professional mangrove trimmer. Here's a list. This is where you find the list here on the Florida DEP page. And then also reach out to your local government and find out if you have any additional encumbrances on your property. There may be instances where there's a conservation easement or some other kind of native habitat protections there that aren't that aren't well known. And so you might want to reach out to them just to avoid any concerns. And even if you know you have an exemption and you want to go out and trim your mangroves, always take a photo before and after you trim your mangroves, and this protects you, okay? So I want to kind of wrap up here just by reminding us why we should care about mangroves and why we should be concerned about their protection. And I have these are all three photos that I took, and the one on the left obviously is my kayak. I love to go out and spend time in nature however I can get it, and kayaking is one of those ways. And mangroves, if you haven't paddled through a mangrove tunnel, go do it. It is really a special kind of quiet that you can hear inside of those mangrove tunnels, especially as the tide is kind of rushing through and you can hear the mangrove crabs climbing up and down the prop roots. It really is magic. The middle photo is actually in the very middle there. That's my daughter getting ready to fill up a bucket full of water. This is one of our favorite windsurfing spots, and there's a beautiful black mangrove there that provides us with shade and a place to hang our hammock, and a refuge from the hot sun and the wind. And it's well known to my daughter, and she climbs all through it. And so it provides us with recreation, with nature therapy, with water clarity, storm protection, all of these wonderful things, and beauty. You know, the photo on the right is a red mangrove. That's at Emerson Point Preserve. If you're ever here in Manatee County and you want to go for a nice walk and look at mangroves, go to Emerson Point. There are these incredibly beautiful red mangroves that are dropping down their prop roots, and they create these lattice shapes that are just incredible. And so, you know, these are just some ways that I can highlight why I care and why I think other people should care too. So remember, mangroves are trees. This is a question I get all the time because people think of them as bushes, but they're not. They're trees. Remember that one from Lee County that was 64 feet tall, probably taller now. Best option if they're going to trim is what we call a window trim or a vista trim. And they support so many other life forms, birds, fish, snakes, reptiles, bivalves, sponges, all of those wonderful creatures that we like to see. They are protected by state law as well as by federal wetlands rules. So call prior to trimming. And if you're working with someone and they say, oh, I've got a grandfathered exemption, well, ask to see proof of that from the Department of Environmental Protection, check for permits, you know, check historical compliance issues. This is more if you're helping somebody through the process. You know, there's a lot of different ways that you can find this information. And if you need any help in locating these resources, I'd be more than happy to help you walk through that process. And with that, I am going to end my slideshow and stop my share. And I do have some resources that I'm going to link in the chat box for everyone.
Okay, well, we do have some questions. And Carol Johns wanted to know, we had talked a little bit, I think you had indicated that there was some decline, they are declining. And I thought I heard you say habitat loss, but she also was wondering because of extra salt water or saltwater intrusion.
So in some instances, this does happen. So in particular, in areas where you've had coastal development that kind of cuts off one section of mangroves from the freshwater systems upland, you can end up with areas that have too much salt, and then the mangroves aren't able to survive in that area. And this is, you know, you can see this in quite a few places. I know that there are some areas in Charlotte County where this has been pretty well documented, where historic hydrological flows were stopped up by like the building of a road, for instance, and then it resulted in too high of salinity, and the mangroves have died.
Okay, another question we have is Bill Rosenthal, and I know you covered this, but let's go ahead and repeat it. He said, isn't it now against the law to trim mangroves once they get over a certain height? And I think we learned that. I'm gonna let you say that. But Alyssa, did you indicate what the penalty of these over pruning is?
Yes, so 6 feet is the minimum overall height for a mangrove on a property, as long as it meets the riparian mangrove fringe definition as set forth in the state law. And if you need help figuring that out, again, you know, reach out to me and I can look at an aerial image and try to help you figure that out, whether it does or not. But yes, so 6 feet overall minimum height, right? You can't go any lower than 6 feet is what the state says in the state law. Now, depending on the nature of the violation, so the state DEP kind of has a matrix that they have set up, looking at things like how good was the quality of the habitat prior to the alteration of the mangroves? Does it look like it's going to grow back quickly, or is this something that's going to result in the death or you know, demise of these the mangroves or the community? And so they kind of rank it accordingly in that matrix that they have, and you can end up with fines of $200,000 or more in certain cases, depending.
Okay. So it's not just a smack on the hand.
No, no, it's not. It's not, especially in cases where you're looking at, over 2,000 square feet of mangroves altered, you can really start to rack up a serious fine.
Okay. So to your story of when you were out there waving somebody down, they wanted to know why that person was cutting mangroves to begin with.
So to this guy's credit, the property owner had told him that they had a permit. And he hadn't asked to see it. And so, they were not allowed to be trimmed. There was no permit, but the property owner wanted to be able to have the certain view that they wanted. And so they hired somebody who didn't know any better. And then that person got in trouble.
So what if someone's view is completely obstructed by that 6 foot height and that width there at the shoreline? Is there a way, and you talked about that vista pruning, but how can they get that view of the water?
Right. So a vista prune is generally between 6 and 12 feet. You're going to be removing lateral branches. So you have to let the mangroves grow up above a certain point before you can do a successful vista prune.
Okay.
In most cases, I think that the 6 foot minimum overall height was chosen when the law was written, generally because when you look at coastal development, the house is going to be set up higher on some fill back behind where that mangrove shoreline is. So in general, 6 feet is not going to impede anyone's view.
Okay. And then Yen Chen up in Leon County wants to know, this is an interesting question, are there any snakes in mangroves?
Yeah, we have a really beautiful mangrove snake, actually. It looks a little bit like a banded water snake. It is non-venomous, very docile, actually. Don't do this, but I did find one crossing the road the other night and picked it up and took it to its lovely home.
And then you washed your hands.
Yes, yeah.
Okay. Wilson Wilcox is wondering, are the mangroves under threats by any invasive animals or any invasive pests like iguanas or some other insect pests that we have had introduced?
No, not that I know of. I haven't heard any kind of insect pest or animal threats to mangroves. It's mostly invasive plant species like Brazilian pepper and carrotwood and Australian pine.
Okay.
There are 2 escaped species of mangrove. They actually escaped from Fairchild Botanical Garden during a hurricane. And one of them, there's Bruguiera gymnorrhiza, and then Lumnicera racemosa. And I believe it's the Lumnicera racemosa that is actually invasive now in that area because it outcompetes our native mangroves. And so they're actually having to manage for those invasive mangroves.
Oh, okay. And we're getting some really good questions. Why aren't the buttonwoods protected?
That's a good question.
Oh. Alyssa thinks they should be, I see, but they're also so commercially available and easy to plant. And I just love them as a landscape plant, honestly.
Right. And you can find both varieties in our natural environment too. A lot of people think that the silver buttonwood was something that was created for landscapes, but we actually find it out in the wild.
Yeah. Julia is asking for a link to the 2070 report.
Okay, I can grab that real quick.
And I know you can do 2 things at once because you're a super mom and multitask. So Carol has a mangrove seedling that's grown in her garden pond to about 4 foot by 4 foot. First of all, is this legal? And that's my question. And 2, what are her responsibilities of this plant that she has in her pond?
So it is likely that this mangrove does not meet the definition of a riparian mangrove fringe, so it would not be protected under the state rule.
Okay, and then if I want to pick up the Rhizophora mangli, the red mangrove propagules and propagate them, am I allowed to do that, or would I get in trouble? Or
so you as long as it is not rooted into the ground and you are not taking it and then taking it somewhere else and then selling it, right?
Okay.
If you're just kind of, repropagating it, if one is like laying at the bottom of a kayak ramp and you pick it up and scooch it over to the side, you're fine.
Okay. All right. Shelley says that someone in her neighborhood is charged $100 per foot for overpruning under 6 feet, and he just takes the hit every couple of years, cuts them very low, pays the fine, and they do grow back nicely.
Mhm. Yeah, and it depends on which species of mangroves those are. Black mangroves tend to favor a harder trim, or I should say they don't like it, but they can handle a harder trim than the other. Red mangroves, because of their adventitious roots, they have this horizontal pattern of growth, but if you continually cut them back, they really they get a lot of stress from that, and so they don't harbor that as well. And yeah, I mean, to her point, there are folks who are just willing to shell out the money to continually violate the state rule.
Oh, I want to talk about that towards the end, and we're getting there. But Cheryl's condo association believes that the weeds in the mangroves helps to stabilize the soil during a hurricane surge. For example, they let the beach morning glory, Ipomea imperati, to cover the mangroves. Is this correct, or will it harm the mangroves?
So, we see things like coin vine, the morning glory, knickerbean. These things will grow in and on mangroves, and in disturbed environments like a condo shoreline, they can get a little out of control, and they may shade out some of the foliage on the mangroves. So it's not uncommon that you can do a little bit of maintenance on them, but I wouldn't recommend removing them entirely because they are native plants, and they do have habitat benefit.
Okay. Okay. So I guess I heard you say it's okay to leave them alone.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. Vicky wants to go back to the guy that you busted out there. And but she wondered what you were doing out there. Were you called in as a to stop the presses kind of thing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so this is something that's really important to recognize, is that in areas of local delegation, especially, one of the benefits of having local delegation of the state mangrove rule is that you have people in the community who are ready at the drop of a hat if someone calls and says somebody is taking down mangroves, can someone please come out and see? And so since I worked for Sarasota County, I was in the county, somebody called, I was able to go out the same day and exactly what was going on. In areas that are managed through the Department of Environmental Protection, they have huge districts that they're managing. The South District of the DEP goes all the way from Manatee County down to the Keys. So, their office is in Fort Myers, but that's a huge area for them to try to police. So it can be a challenge sometimes for them to get out the same day something is happening.
All right, and then Shelley wants to know, did the red and black mangroves intermingle along the shorelines? I see both roots and the little fingers pushing up through the sand.
Yes, absolutely. And this is why I say that white mangroves even stick up propagules, because if you say something for certain about something in nature, you will always find an example showing you otherwise. So yes, red mangroves just tend to be the most waterward, but you have all three species will intermingle equally. Sometimes you'll find only black mangroves. Sometimes you'll find a bunch of white mangroves with these little knobby propagules. So yes, absolutely.
For those of you who live in Pinellas County, the boardwalk out from Safety Harbor, you can see all three, and they're basically all living in the same system, doing their job. How far north have these mangroves migrated in Florida?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so on the East Coast, they've been found as far north as St. Augustine. And then on the West Coast, I'm not sure. They're saying they're in Port St. Joe,
right?
And that would be about what we would expect. Black mangroves are the most cold hardy of the three species that are protected, but. So it's typically black mangroves that you would see migrating northward, but a freeze is gonna knock them back. So any place that gets kind of frequent freezes, you're not gonna find them.
Okay.
But with climate change,
right. And so that kind of leads us into Diane's question from St. Johns County. So mostly they have black mangroves, but as the winters have become milder, reds and whites are migrating north. They are wondering, what is this transition about? Are they going to push out the cordgrass, or, how is this succession going to go? Are they going to lose some of their traditional native plants as these more southern native plants move up?
Absolutely. And we have, we have examples of that happening here in the Tampa Bay area, where we have traditional salt marsh ecosystems that are being dominated now by mangroves rather than by juncus. Down here, it's Juncus rhamarianus. And so, you know, as the focal species in that ecosystem, right? You go from a salt marsh to a mangrove, it's going to change everything. It changes the soil, it changes the hydrology, it changes what species are present. And in a lot of cases, you know, land managers are now having to make the tough decision about managing for succession, right? They have to try to preserve these salt marshes. And in some cases, they're going to provide certain ecosystem services that you wouldn't get from mangroves, or habitat for an imperiled species that may be endemic to your area. So, you know, there's a lot of good discussion in the scientific community about when you manage for succession in the face of climate change. It's going to be a question that we're continuing to try to answer.
To observe and to answer.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's complicated for sure.
Mhm.
Let's see, are they investigated, or is there an investigation going on between mangrove decline and manatee decline? Because you said how important they were for the seagrass beds.
Mhm.
Is anyone looking at that? Do you know?
Well, you know, here in the state of Florida, we haven't had any drastic reduction in the overall kind of coverage of mangroves since about the 1950s, 60s. So that was kind of the extent of the massive removal of mangroves. And so I would not want to make the suggestion that current mangrove practices are somehow limiting seagrass potential. I don't have the data to say anything like that. Yeah, I mean, healthier ecosystems in general, they support each other, they're all connected. Sure.
Sure. And also wondering, Mary is wondering if red tide affects mangroves.
Well, kind of the opposite. Mangroves can have an effect on red tide, right? So they are really great at pulling things like nitrogen and phosphorus out of the water column and storing it in the soil. And so if you have a lot of disturbance in mangrove systems, you can release some of that back into the water column.
Okay. And then Fred is wondering if mangrove ecosystem is more diverse than a salt marsh.
You know, I don't know the answer to that question. Depends on if you're
Yeah.
talking about only plant species or
Right.
also faunal species,
Right.
you know.
Right. You know, I think about all the fish and the crabs and the snakes and the, you know, everything that uses that estuary. And someone's wondering if there's any native orchids in mangroves. I don't know.
You find them if you go down into Everglades, where we have a really extensive amount of mangroves. You will find native orchids and epiphytes growing in mangroves down in that area. And I have found cardinal plant, giant air plant growing in mangroves here in our area.
Yes. And then I'm gonna, I think we're about done, but somebody does want to know what that aster is behind you, Alyssa.
I don't know.
He's going to find out, because we do have a webinar coming up called All About Asters. And so Tune in for that. She's going to show up with that aster. She took it up in the Smoky Mountains. So
yeah, it just is nice. I don't know what it is though.
So one of the things I wanted to tell you all, we still have quite a few people on. I was at the beach with my mother-in-law, and she was aggravated by the sea oats because they were interfering with our sunrise. And she said, are they going to get any taller? What should we do about those sea oats? She's from Minnesota, honey. So, you know, she doesn't know always. So I said, you know, sea oats are very important in the stabilization of dunes, and Florida wouldn't be here if it weren't for the sea oats, because it would just wash us away. And she said, you know, they should put up a sign. And I said, they do. I'll take you to the sign tomorrow, or I'll take you to the sign after we're done with coffee. And likewise, the mangroves, you know, people who move here just don't understand how important they are to Florida's ecology, and the fact that Florida is even here. And so after Hurricane Andrew, I remember taking a boat out into Key Biscayne and seeing how damaged the outer keys were, how the mangroves got all tore up. And then I realized if those mangroves haven't been there, the impact, like you had said, how well they absorb the energy of those tides, what would have we would have looked like without those mangroves there. And so I think it's our jobs as master gardeners to teach people about the importance of the mangroves, about the importance of the sea oats, and how that contributes to the ecology of Florida, and what we do in our landscapes and how we can help to protect those. So, and it's interesting, Alyssa, how many ecology questions came in for you today, you know, because it's really part of the whole big picture as it all plays together. So I'll give you a few minutes for closing remarks if you want to say anything. I saw that you posted the 20.
Yes, I did put the 2070 in the chat, as well as a few other links. There's a couple of videos there. One of them is a 2-minute video that just takes you on kind of an underwater view of red mangroves, and it's very calming and beautiful. So I encourage you to check that out. But just, you know, in closing, one of the things to remember.
Somebody's asked about recommended reading. Was there a book that you would recommend?
Gosh, you know, I don't think I do have a recommended book. I can think about it though, and maybe I can send it to you for a follow-up.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah.
But please, any other comments you want to make?
Yeah, just do remember, as you go out into the community and talk to folks, you know, remind them that mangroves are trees, that they're not just something weedy that's blocking their view, and that they do have all of these wonderful services that they provide to our entire state, both in tourist dollars and property protection and habitat. And they're beautiful and wonderful, and go out and enjoy them.
Great. Thank you so much, Alyssa. And I do want to remind everybody that these webinars are recorded and they are posted on the Master Gardener website. And please take the survey as you're signing out. So thank you, everybody. And thank you so much, Alyssa. This was awesome. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay, take care.